sublimates. The moments during which Hygeia reaches unusually high temperatures of where water ice can sublimate is probably when the low reflect.
And now when we talk about depression,
as any student of history will know, the rule of Joseph Stalin resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Many of Stalin's victims were, of course, ordinary people sent to the Gulag by figures like Nikolai Yezhov and Lavrentiy Beria. But several million others also died of starvation. While it's generally accepted that the famines of the 1930s were intentional, perhaps even genocidal, it's less well known that Stalin's agricultural policies were directly informed by the unscientific, some would even say crazy, theories of one man, Trofim Lysenko. A scientist who rose from almost complete obscurity in the 1920s to a position of absolute power in Soviet science by the 1940s, Lysenko's influence was so great, in fact, that the journalist Sam Keen asserted that he probably killed more human beings than any individual scientist in history. So, who exactly was Trofim Lysenko? What were his theories, and how did he get himself into such a position of power in the first place? I'm your host David, and today we are going to explore the pseudoscience of Lysenkoism. This is the Cold War. Trofim Lysenko's story begins in Poltava, in what is now modern-day Ukraine, in the late 19th century. Born on September 17, 1898, Lysenko grew up in a fairly well-to-do peasant family in what was an otherwise impoverished corner of the Russian Empire. Presumably, working on the farm as a peasant inspired him to pursue agriculture. Though Lysenko did not learn to write until the age of 13, he studied horticulture at school before entering the Kyiv Agricultural Institute in 1922 and graduated with a degree in agronomy in 1925. The period during which Lysenko came of age was a period marked by obsession with modernity and progress in the arts and sciences. Scientists like Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel, for example, had made huge strides in the study of genetics in the 19th century. Darwin, on the one hand, had developed a theory of evolution known as natural selection, in which members of species with the strongest traits survived and passed those down to their offspring, otherwise known as survival of the fittest. On the other hand, Mendel's experiments with pea plants showed that the traits Darwin described were passed down through genes. Though genes can be affected by random mutations, in general, they are passed on unchanged from parent to offspring. However, beneficial traits establish themselves over generations as they're passed down to more and more members of that species. This is, of course, admittedly an incredible simplification. These two theories, in effect, establish the foundational principles of modern biology. Now, during the same period, a French scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had developed his own theory of evolution called inheritance of acquired characteristics. In short, this theory proposed that a species could somehow pass on characteristics acquired during its lifetime directly to its offspring. Applied to plants and agriculture, Lamarck's theory implied that, for example, if you exposed a crop like wheat to extreme temperatures in 1 year, the following year the wheat would be able to grow in that cold temperature without issues. By contrast, Darwin and Mendel's ideas asserted that beneficial changes to a plant species could be propagated through natural selection and plant breeding over time. Growing up as a budding biologist in late Imperial Russia and then the early USSR, these were the two theories that dominated Lysenko's early academic life. After graduating in 1925, he went to work in Azerbaijan with the renowned Soviet agronomist Nikolai Vavilov, where he experimented with a process called vernalization. This involved exposing crops to extreme temperatures and moisture to help them survive the harsh Russian winters. His experiments were based on Lamarck's theories and the belief that you could directly influence the physiology of a species using environmental factors. Vavilov himself had done experiments on converting winter wheat into spring wheat and vice versa, but the pair found little luck.
Thanks.
By the
Amos
mid-1920s,
is
it was
wearing the
clear that
advanced
Lamarck's
ear gowns as we
theories
speak.
were incorrect, and
How
he
much?
had been
Couple
largely
hundred change.
discredited.
Enough to buy a sandwich or
Now,
two.
nevertheless, whether or
We gotta
not
hold back
Lysenko's
the rest
experiments
until the
were
lab does the
actually useful
autopsy.
quickly became irrelevant.
Paperwork, you know.
Let us consider the
Should take
bigger
more than a
picture in the
couple
early
days.
1920s.
So
As
the
we
check's
have
in the mail.
explored in several previous
Hey,
videos,
don't worry.
the Bolsheviks
The boys
envisioned
upstairs
communism
wanna keep our best
and
and brightest
Marxism
happy.
as paths to
Any
completely
idea what you
new
wanna spend
types of
it on?
society.
I
In
was
practice,
thinking
this usually meant
maybe a
interrogating every
companion
existing
for my
form of
animal at
knowledge
home.
to assess its compatibility with the
that.
collective principles
Buy
of
yourself
Marxism, as
something
well as
nice.
attempts to seize
Once
the
you start
reins
carving
of
up that
supposedly
juicy
naturally
bacon, kid,
occurring
the
phenomena.
taste never goes away.
Darwinism, closely related
things
to
in life.
Mendelian genetics,
Believe
was
me, you just
one
be
such
wanting
theory.
more and more.
After Darwin's theories were published, several sociologists joined and brought forward the idea of so-called social Darwinism, which applied Darwin's principles of survival of the fittest to people and societies. The fundamental question for the Bolsheviks was, could a theory that put such emphasis on individuality and unpredictable events be compatible with a cohesive collective society? The answer, unsurprisingly, was a resounding no. The denunciation of social Darwinism amongst Bolsheviks, however, did not necessarily mean that Darwin and Mendel's scientifically proven theories of biology also had to be discredited. But then a quite specific set of historical circumstances came to be. The first was the rise of Joseph Stalin to a position of unchallenged power. This brought with it a hitherto unprecedentedly orthodox and hardline interpretation of Marxist ideology. The second, as historians William de Jong Lambert and Nikolai Krementsov outline, was the series of crises the Soviet Union faced in the 1920s. The launching of the ambitious First Five-Year Plan, crash industrialization, the forced collectivization of peasantry, and extensive militarization led to a horrific agricultural crisis and widespread famine. The state thus needed a radical solution to its problems, but it also needed one which fit into Marxist ideology. Needless to say, the opportunity this unique set of circumstances posed was not lost on the humble, yet opportunistic peasant from Poltava. In the late 1920s, Lysenko started claiming that he had discovered a method to fertilize fields without using fertilizers or minerals. He then claimed that he had trained peas to grow in winter, garnering him attention in a Pravda article which cited that his work was turning barren fields of the Transcaucasus green in winter so that cattle will not perish from poor feeding and the peasant Turk will live through the winter without trembling for tomorrow. This of course drew attention in Communist Party circles. When Lysenko then asserted the possibility of growing orange trees in Siberia, they only became more intrigued. Was Lysenko the savior from famine that the Soviet Union needed? Well, the thing is, Lysenko did not read credible biological research, nor did he use standard scientific methods for his experiments. This made his early work effectively impossible to disprove. With this, the work of Lysenko and other Lamarckian scientists quickly gained the attention of Stalin as the Vozhd sought solutions to collectivization. Inspired by Lysenko's theories, Stalin forced farmers in the kolkhozy to plant seeds very close together in the belief that plants from the same class never competed with each other. He also forbade the use of fertilizers and pesticides. The 163-fold increase in farmland cultivated using Lysenkoist methods resulted in a huge drop in food production, contributing to 7 million deaths across the USSR by 1933. Consequently, Lysenko was widely ridiculed outside the Soviet Union, with one British biologist stating that he was, quote, completely ignorant of the elementary principles of genetics and plant physiology. To talk to Lysenko was like trying to explain differential calculus to a man who did not know his 12 times table. Still, despite the evident shortcomings of Lysenko's methods, none of them really mattered. Why? Well, Lysenko parroted the party line, and his peasant background made him the perfect figurehead for Stalin's increasingly totalitarian interpretation of Marxism. For example, Lysenko stated publicly that there was no class struggle between the same species, and that, quote, nobody knows what a species is, and everything written in books is not true, effectively denouncing Mendelian genetics entirely. Vadim Birstein concurs, explaining that Soviet leaders appreciated Lysenko's denial of the existence of genes as the basis of inheritance and of species as the basis of evolution. It was much easier for them to understand Lysenko's simplified anthropomorphic ideas that individuals within a species help each other and inherit changes from environmental conditions. Lysenko's peasant background and dizzying successes thus earned him the moniker the Barefoot Scientist, as well as the opportunity to conduct a speech at the 17th Communist Party Congress in 1934. In 1935, he gave another speech in front of Stalin himself, arguing that his opponents were no better than the peasants who resisted collectivization. Further, he suggested that anyone who disagreed with his theories was an opponent of Marxism. In response, Stalin stood and applauded, shouting, "Bravo, Comrade Lysenko, bravo!" As Lysenko's speech alludes, though, the ideas of a man who claimed that you could transform durum wheat into bread wheat, the agricultural equivalent of suggesting you could teach a lion to give birth to a domestic house cat, did not go unchallenged by the scientific community. Indeed, the Soviet Union had arguably the best genetics community in the world prior to the 1930s. Among its most renowned figures were Nikolai Koltsov, a Russian biologist and pioneer of modern genetics, as well as the aforementioned Nikolai Vavilov, with whom Lysenko had worked in Azerbaijan. Unlike Lysenko, Vavilov did actually accept that Lamarckism was bogus and was all too aware of the dangers posed by Lysenko's bizarre refusal to accept this. Vavilov was particularly respected. In 1929, he had formed and led the All-Union Academy of Agricultural Scientists, or VASNIL, which remained the most important agricultural research institute in the USSR right up until its dissolution in 1991. Nevertheless, as Stalin's terror picked up in the late 20s and early 30s, scientists like Koltsov and Vavilov were increasingly denounced as opponents of Marxism. Such opponents of the state's doctrine were either arrested, fired, or had their research institutes closed. As Birstein summarizes, from the 1920s to the 1950s, one needed to have courage to withstand the ideological pressure of the Soviet state and to retain one's scientific and human beliefs. Biologists could be punished for two crimes: non-acceptance of Lysenko's doctrine and protests against the arrests of colleagues. The second was especially dangerous. Both of these so-called crimes are exactly what scientists like Koltsov and Vavilov went on to commit. They fought hard to defend colleagues who had been removed from their posts, but by the late 1930s found themselves at the heart of a tragically futile ideological battle for the future of Soviet science. Vavilov was removed from his post as president of VASNIL in 1935, and by 1937, Lysenko had been installed as its head. Jerry Coyne explains that this effectively made him the dictator of Soviet agriculture and genetics. Now wielding enormous influence, Lysenko and his allies published a series of articles denouncing Koltsov and Vavilov, with Koltsov singled out as a fascist at the 1937 annual session of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the institution that sat above VASNIL. 2 years later, in 1939, Koltsov was nominated by the biology branch of the Academy of Sciences to become a full member. The day before the election, however, he found himself the subject of a Pravda article entitled "Pseudoscientists Should Not Be Members of the Academy of Scientists." Ultimately, Lysenko and his ally Nikolai Tsitsin were elected instead, granting them even more institutional power. In 1940, Koltsov died of a supposed heart attack, although he was likely poisoned.
88.
Vavilov was arrested by the NKVD and sent to prison, where he would die in 1943. The reason for his arrest? According to the warrant, pushing forward hostile theories, Vavilov is fighting against the theory and work of Lysenko, which has crucial importance for agriculture in the USSR.
Dinner time.
Over the course of Stalin's rule, at least 3,000 other mainstream biologists would meet similar fates to Vavilov and Koltsov.
Your floor number,
Lysenkoism
please.
seemingly had won. But Lysenko was not done just yet.
88.
Though his meteoric rise stalled over the course of the Great Patriotic War, the burgeoning Cold War created even more opportunities for him simply because he opposed the Western approach to genetics. His magnum opus was perhaps his performance at VASNIL in July 1948, where,
Zubin was
with
the first
Stalin's
Nexus
permission,
6 I'd come up
Lysenko
against. There
held
was
a
something in his
week-long
eyes,
session.
an almost
His
primordial
keynote
desire to
speech,
live.
entitled
Most of the
On the
3s,
Situation
4s, and
in
5s I'd
Biological
seen would
Science
just give
was
up when you
published
had
in
'em. But
Pravda
these
a few days
sixes,
later.
they were a whole other breed.
300,000 copies of the address were printed and distributed across the USSR, with the propaganda campaign culminating in the Soviet government stating that Lysenkoism was
Portrait
the
of
only
the
correct
sleep-deprived.
theory and that genetics was bourgeois pseudoscience. The American biologist and writer Stephen Jay Gould later described this announcement as the most chilling passage in all of the literature of 20th century science. Still, newly communist states in Europe and then in Asia, namely Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and eventually China, implemented Lysenkoist agricultural policies across the board undeterred. Up to this point, it's hard to argue.
When I say
Please, can you control your rat?
I'll have you know that Ricky's a purebred Chihuahua, and he's totally real.
Things going good at Tyrell Corporation?
Boring. Old man Tyrell's been on a Wagner kick lately. He never shuts up.
You also do outside work?
Sweetie, I never go outside. It's bad for the glands.
How about Nexus 6? You know a lot about them?
I think you should be going now.
Understand good, it holds deep meaning for me now. Where be your research on Nexus 6? I need test studies, contacts, the works.
Only simulator. Extraterrestrial gravity.
One more minute, you be swallowing this explosive. 3 more minutes, they be hosing you off the True Life building across town.
No, I swear. I don't have anything. If I did, I'd give it to you.
My people sick and dying. You tell me something.
Talk to Dr. Tyrell.
Tell me something I don't know.
The organ designers, Maraji, Hannibal Chu, Luther and Lance. They're closer to him than I am.
Where?
DNA Row. They're all working down on DNA Row. No.
You one miserable package man.
No, please, don't.
Pick up.
Hope you aren't camped out there with a bottle of tequila.
Oh, very funny.
Early bird slays the worm, McCoy.
Don't worry, I'm up, Lieutenant. What's the buzz?
One of Tyrell's employees got his fat face splattered all over the marble interior of the Tyrell building.
Inside?
That's right. But we also got a sweet little break on it. Tyrell surveillance system recorded the whole shebang.
Beautiful. How many perps?
Just one. I don't know if it's related to the Runciter deal or not. Tyrell security will have the disc for you when you get there. You'll be good, killer.
Your floor number, please.
Roof. Ground floor. Roof. Ground floor.
Your floor number, please.
Roof.
McCoy, LPD.
Just a minute.
Where do I go?
Drug test on the east wing, 66th floor. Here's the footage from the security cameras. You get a pretty good look at the man's face.
How'd he get past you guys?
He pretended to be a delivery man. Dr. Eisenduller ordered in a lot, so it didn't seem unusual.
I may have more questions for you later on.
Yes, sir.
Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Cái đồ ăn ở đó rất là ngon. Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh. Tôi rất mong ông đó đang nhìn nào nhanh. Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh. Mấy giờ tôi phải tới đó? Mấy giờ tôi phải tới đó? Cái đồ ăn ở đó rất là ngon. Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh. Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Mấy giờ tôi phải tới đó? Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh. Cái đồ ăn ở đó rất là ngon. Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh. Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh. Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Mấy giờ tôi phải tới đó?
One more thing.
I've told you everything I know, Detective. I gotta work. These monitors don't watch themselves.
Yeah, it's a tough gig.
Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Cái đồ ăn ở đó rất là ngon. Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Tôi rất mong anh nào nhanh.
Jesus.
I seen worse, but not by much.
Learn anything?
You could strain him through a sieve.
Obviously, he'd been killed with an explosive, and not just because he'd been plastered on the wall with 1,000 strokes. The detonator wire I pulled out of his skull told the whole story. The killer was an expert. The charge had been big enough to do the job, but not big enough to shatter the soundproof walls of the float chamber. But I wondered why the killer didn't just shoot him. Disgusting.
Messy up there, isn't it?
Lagging behind again?
Guza didn't say anything about me working with a partner.
Oh, in a pig's ass, Slim. No, I'm following up on my own. Could be it's linked to this Tyrell debacle.
How's yours connected to mine?
I'm still fitting the pieces together. You know the Moonbus massacre that went down last month?
Gaff mentioned something about it.
The rogue skin jobs probably flew to Earth. And one of them is a demolitions expert, similar MO to your Vic upstairs.
Hell of a coincidence.
I'll call you if I find out anything more about your case.
Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Ông đó đang nhìn mình. Mấy giờ tôi phải tới đó? Ông đó đang nhìn mình cái đồ ăn ở đó. Xin hỏi cái chỗ cảnh sát ở đâu ạ? Đồ ăn ở đó rất là ngon. Mấy giờ tôi không thấy anh làm nhanh.
Laboratory. Ground floor. Mainframe and shooting range. Ground floor. Mainframe. Laboratory. Laboratory. Mainframe and shooting range. Laboratory. Mainframe and shooting range.
During his last election campaign, Governor Kulvig promised a bold new plan of action to clean up the worst regions of the highly toxic debris that surrounds our city, the so-called Kipple. Just how much progress has been made since then? We spoke to the governor just before his weekly meeting with the city council.
Our studies have shown that the Kipple's effect upon Los Angeles is minor. The radiation and toxic waste is contained in relatively small pockets, all miles distant from the city center. Nevertheless, cleaning things up out there is a worthwhile goal, especially with the thousands of specials living on the city fringes. For now, all I can say is that we're looking at several options, and I'm sure everyone will be pleasantly surprised by our final proposal.
You keeping busy, pal?
Nah, the place has been pretty quiet the last couple of days.
Scanning video disk. One enhanceable image found. Adding enhanceable photographs to Kaya database. Tyrell Grav Test Lab.
The earring was shaped like an insect. I didn't know much about jewelry, but it looked like junk to me, like the cheap crap sold at the stands and shops of Anemoid Row. Give me a hard copy of that.
When I hear people say this administration is motivated by racism, I'm like, I wish. I wish it's just racism. Racism is simple. People know how to deal with it. This shit is not. Like this guy from Norway, just a normal white guy, nothing remarkable. And he was detained and deported from the US because he had this meme in his phone. I have to say those officers have really good eyes. For some reason, they recognized that this picture was J.D. Vance. That's impressive. I wouldn't be able to tell. Vance is not the only ugly motherfucker out there. And they locked up that white guy for that meme. So this is not just normal racism. Okay, minorities in America know how to survive normal racism, but this is more. This level of snowflake meltdown is actually something new. Never happened in American politics. I used to talk shit about China a lot because, back in China, I always felt like being watched. It felt terrible. Sometimes I say something privately and my friends were like,